Hello, testing. Good morning. Noia Maori and Bulavinaka. Hello and welcome to the In Conversation on Day 2 of the 9th World Arts Summit and Culture. Firstly, I'd like to acknowledge the First Nations people of this land, giving respect to elders, past, present, and emerging. They are our wisdom keepers, and their knowledge of the land, sky, and ocean is key to our future. My name is Letila Mitchell. I'm from an island called Rotuma, which is north of Fiji in the Pacific. I'm the cultural advisor for the Pacific Community, which is an intergovernmental organization that looks after 22 Pacific Island nations and territories. Today's topic for the In Conversation session is bridging the gap between rights and responsibilities in artistic freedom. As you're all aware, during the In Conversation session, a pair of invited speakers will engage in a lively discussion about today's theme, responsibilities in artistic freedoms. Creating and maximizing opportunities, the intention for this session is to create dialogue between these two incredible speakers and also to answer questions that have been sent from all around the world. To spice it up, they will see these questions for the first time today. Our speakers for today's In Conversation session are Simone Brault, the CEO for the Canada Arts Council, and Liwaa Yazji, filmmaker, screenwriter, playwright, and poet from Syria, currently living in Berlin. Since 2014, Simone Brault has served as Director and CEO of the Canada Council for the Arts. He has been active in the cultural sector for over 30 years and has been a driving force behind several major projects. Since 2019, he has served as the chair of IFICA. He has received numerous distinctions for his commitment to the social recognition of the arts and culture, including the Order of Canada and the National Order of Quebec. Liwaa Yazji is an established filmmaker, screenwriter, playwright, and poet. She lived and worked in Damascus before moving to pursue her own work projects in Beirut and then in Berlin. Her work is internationally celebrated. Her debut feature film, Haunted, premiered in FID Marseille and won the jury-mentioned special prize, and Alwa bronze in FIFAG Tunisia. Her play, Goats, premiered in the Royal Court Theatre in London. Her play, Q&Q, on the debate of giving birth under the conditions of violence, was commissioned by the Royal Exchange Theatre in Manchester. She has received several prestigious awards and grants. For rights to artistic freedom to be recognized and respected, we must acknowledge that we need different models of leadership to bridge the gaps between rights and responsibilities. Sharing their lived experiences, our speakers today will consider how leadership voices are being recognized, amplified, or silenced, the different ways that power is or could be shared, and emerging models of cooperation and collaboration that are making a real difference to safeguarding artistic freedom. And to begin today's In Conversation, I'd like to pose a question to you both. Many of us here in the room are arts leaders in our own way, in our own families or communities with significant responsibilities. At the same time, we're also individuals with rights to our own artistic and cultural freedom. Are there tensions in how this plays out as we live our everyday lives? Juggling these two roles, how do you balance your individual rights and freedoms with the responsibilities you carry as a leader? Okay, over to you, Simon and Liwaa.
Yeah. First of all, I would like also to add that I'm also a General Assembly member in Ittijahat, Independent Culture. It seems like it fell down somewhere in the presentation. And then I will go back to your answer. When I was first contacted to be in this conversation, I was enthusiastic. Yeah, great, of course. I live now in Berlin, and if I was still living in Syria, the whole reaction would have been different. Okay, I'm free to address this topic of freedom. But when I was told that it would be live-streamed, it feels like all of a sudden I was sent back to Syria. Am I really free? After all these years of protest, war, artists, friends, colleagues in Syria being persecuted, detained, imprisoned, tortured, killed, silenced, exiled, or even left to wither, to die in all kinds of depression and disappointment, illnesses away in foreign lands? Am I really free? After all of these years, again, my family is still in Syria, and enjoying this extreme right of my freedom of expression means, among all other meanings, that they will be, or might be, harmed socially, politically, physically. Am I really free? If I keep juggling this idea rationally, I will reach to this point thinking that if I was practicing this extreme freedom of expression, I will lose my right to enter Syria, which is a very, very high price for me to pay. I need to keep this rare advantage for someone like me who is bluntly against the regime and whose art practice isn't short of examples. But still, do I want to lose this right of being in my own homeland because I want to cherish another right? A right for a right. Am I really free? Is this a free choice? But yet, here I am. I feel like myself is the embodiment of this bridging between responsibility and rights. Thank you.
I need to say first that I'm very honored, very privileged to be in conversation with
Me
you,
too.
Liwaa. I mean, obviously, I do live in a democratic country, and I'm very interested to think about how democracy can progress. And over the last decade, I've been very inspired by the words of an artist activist who's Canadian but now lives in New York, who's really, writing a lot about democracy. And I will quote her because I think she says very clearly, where I am now. And she says, Astra Taylor is her name. She says, with each successive push, women, racialized people, indigenous people, colonized people, disabled people, queer, transgender people, trade unionists, and other visionaries have not just spread, but transformed the concepts of freedom and equality, giving them substantive meaning while revealing their necessary interconnections. Every step of the way, the disparaged and dispossessed have those contentious alignment terms, freedom and equality, at the center of the unfinished and unpredictable path towards that alluring but elusive horizon of self-rule. It has fallen to them to broaden our democratic vista in part because the marginalized are positioned to see truths the powerful cannot or choose not to perceive. So for me, this is a program, kind of a program. The big question, and I'm running the biggest arts funder in Canada, is to try to understand, how we can stop just serving a very narrow portion of the artists and a very narrow portion of the audiences in my country. So what we have trying to do over the last 10 years was really to make quite radical decisions in terms of how we define who is an artist, how we define the communities we want to reach, how we allocate our funding, how we escape from a notion of arts for art's sake, and understand better that the right to create and the right to express yourself needs to be offered to everybody, and especially to the people who have been intentionally excluded from it. And in my country, I would say that probably when I arrived in that job, probably the most fundamental kind of a discovery I made, because it was the end of a very long and very painful process in Canada around truth and reconciliation. We were towards the end. And I had the chance, many times to sit next to people who have been involved in that process. Sometimes, men and women of my age who are survivors of the residential schools in Canada. And listening to them, I did realize that it's true that in my country, we have been practicing for more than 150 years a systematic cultural genocide to erase the culture and the very existence of the indigenous people who are the owner of the lands where we live. And I realized, okay, here I am as an arts funder, we need to do something, and we cannot support, their right to take a space without redefining what we mean by arts and culture, without really think profoundly about, how we do the peer assessment, for instance. Because in the indigenous culture, it's not about artistic excellence. It's not this kind of a ranking people. It's a circle discussing, what is at stake and how we can make a decision. It's not about competition. It's about community building. So by entering that, we created the first thing, that happened when I arrived was the creation of an indigenous program led by indigenous staff with an indigenous perspective. We tripled the amount of money that was invested already and really moving out from the Eurocentric kind of understanding of the arts. And that has been transformative because we kind of, realize that, every, the indigenous people, but every minority, every people that, we are trying to ignore needed to have a better and a real and a decent place on our stages and all of that. And the only way to make that was to make sure that we would know who we are talking, and we needed to be intentional about, how and how we support them. It created a lot of tensions, I must say. It was not a walk in the park. And it's interesting for me that in my country, I heard more arguments around artistic freedom coming from the establishment of the cultural sector, saying, oh yeah, but you're shifting the money, and what about my artistic freedom? And it's interesting because this question of, realizing that, yeah, who should have that right, and how empowering it is. So that definition of democracy for me is very fundamental, and I profoundly believe that there's no future to our democracy if we cannot really give the place that all the minorities are seeking for. And not to do it like, give a small space, giving them not only a place on the stage, but more and more for me, it's front and center of the stage. So that has been more or less and I'm very, 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 very privileged to have been in that position of power where I could push for change, real change. So, yeah.
Yeah. I'll build on your the question that I think that is most important in your discussion, who's right, actually, that
True.
we're really kind of defending. And here I come with some examples from my practice. And I wrote down these examples happening with me, like personally, in working, and of course, like a Syrian artist. But still, I feel like they are triggers for conceptual thinking about similar patterns that maybe different artists in the world are facing. So in the wake of the uprising in Syria, I started filming my feature documentary, Haunted. People were dreamers. Although from being legitimately afraid, they trusted me with their stories and voices and their bare faces and their freedom to talk. They knew if the rushes that I have were to set under the regime hands, we will all be prisoned as a best-case scenario. I had to move with this really dear and improvised gadget and stories to pass the checkpoints in Syria, and they trusting that this dream will save us all. Then I had to smuggle this material to Lebanon to work on my film outside Syria. When people talked in front of the camera about the dangers that we're living, about the repression, all of these things, they thought that by the time the film will finish, the regime will be down. So only the film finished. I had a huge responsibility to look up to now, to keep my protagonist safe. And the question was now, the right of expressing and showing what was happening in Syria, all the atrocities, whether in festivals, TVs, online screening, or the responsibility to keep people safe. Isn't showing the truth also a responsibility for us as artists? Yet, isn't staying safe also a right? Again, am I really free? So, some other films coming out from Syria and similar places also around the world weighed more on the value of the film's input and presented the faces of the people, and sometimes even without their permission, on screens and online, and the result was widely spread films and persecuted protagonists. So really, this is really a big question for us as artists. You know, it's weighing upon these two elements. Again, another issue was really very important for us during these troubled times is the bodies of the victims. Showing them without disguise in the films, you have one argument saying that the world should see what the dictatorship is doing. But at the same time, there are mothers who confronted the bodies of their sons for the first times in films. So again, are we free? So this is a question, and I think this is a huge road to think about between these two things, a right and a responsibility at the same time. I guess this complicates enough everybody's life now. So yeah. I would come to ask you also about, to come out from this examples, to come out a little bit to the journey. I heard that you're leaving Ifaka and like you're leaving the British, the Canadian. Yes.
I think that it's always all about context. It's very interesting to think that in a vast country like Canada, because we are 33 people living in an immense land, in the same country, there are communities in the north of our country, are indigenous communities where there is no drinkable water in Canada now. They are so when we talk about Canada, and a lot of people or any country, some people see that as some kind of an abstraction. And I think that the more you travel and the more you are willing to engage, you realize that peoples in everywhere in the world, but in your own country, are living in very radically different contexts. And what we can do, or what we can tell, and how we can engage with, is there's no recipe. We always need to kind of spend enough time, develop enough relationships to understand what happens here, and what does it mean, and constantly adjust how we talk, how we communicate. It's fascinating to me that, when I go to, Iqaluit in the north of Canada, where right now everything is kind of challenged by climate change because the ice is melting. I've met artists there saying that, okay, you're the Canada Council, you live in the South. I never thought I was living in the South, but I live in the South for them. And they were saying, yes, your reports and your conditions for a grant, that the grant needs to be done within, a year or something like that. It doesn't always work for us here, because this year it took like 4 more months for the ice to melt and to the boat to come into our region. We did not get the material to shoot our movie. So now, our grant period is expired. So all these very real things, all these issues are kind of very profound. And I realize that when we talk about artistic freedom, I like, and it's a very old quote, but from Victor Hugo, who said, everything that increases freedom also increases responsibility. Nothing is so weighty and serious as being free. Freedom is a state of conscientiousness. And for me, that's absolutely true. What is freedom and what is the responsibility, that it carries for us. So again, I'm absolutely immensely privileged to be free, but then I need to be able to gauge every day what the responsibility, what it means in terms of responsibilities. So, we'll start with the...
Just to give
do you want to explain the system?
Yeah, we're also first time exposed to these questions, so we don't know them before.
We never read them.
So we kind of improvise, and if anybody feels that they have better answers, please don't hesitate. So I come with this, at this point, how do we progress a shared understanding of artistic freedom that considers our responsibility as much as our right?
Oh yeah, that's like we were preempting that. Maybe it's not right to say that, but I'm not convinced that it's possible at this point to come to a shared understanding. I think that the problem is that people who are talking about shared understanding most of the time are kind of explaining or declare their own understanding, hoping that the other will share. But I think it's very, very difficult, again, because it's a question of context. And I think that the only thing we can absolutely be certain of is that it's a kind of a moving concept, and that it's not absolute, and that it's absolutely dangerous to make to establish a wall between the right and the responsibility. That's the only thing I can say now. But what's your take on this?
I always come with examples, I'm sorry. Yeah, it's... I'll give an example that now occurred to me where I was working on the play Goats. And this play that I never published in Arabic, also because of reasons that I'm afraid that if I publish it in Arabic, then I will not be able to go to Syria and blah, 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 all of these things again. So I didn't publish it in Arabic, it was only on an English stage. And the play talks about how, like in a Syrian village that is still under the grip of the regime, mentally and administratively, the people in the village, they started to, are pissed off because of the so many dead sons and martyrs they are giving to the regime. So the regime, in a way to compensate them, it started to give them goats, like real goats. And that's the whole absurd setting that I'm talking about. In this absurd setting, a wife of a soldier get abused and kind of semi-physically violated by her soldier man. But all this thing was happening at the same time of Me Too. Okay. So what happened is that I started feeling that there's something wrong with the gestures of the actress on stage, like in the rehearsals. And then she was kind of defying the man when he's coming to kind of like wrestling with her. And there's, like, after 1 week of rehearsals, I felt like all her gestures and attitude was different. And she was like stronger, far stronger than what I've written. And then like, I started to feel that there's something behind the doors happening with the director and all the theater, that they wanted her to be an embodiment of the Me Too movement. And for me, it was like, what? I mean, so I just like felt that there is this moment of, do we share the same rights and responsibility at this moment? I mean, am I practicing my freedom, like artistic freedom, and is this a moment of political correctness and artistic freedom? So I feel that there is a huge thing to be discussed in terms of political correctness and artistic freedom, that it differs from one context to the other.
This is so interesting, and I think it's happening also with translation, for instance. Remember, a couple of years, I wrote a book, and I wanted to say very precise things. I write in French. Then the English translator, a very good translator, kind of came with the first draft of the translation, and I realized that he was adding a layer of meaning coming from his perspective as an Anglophone in Canada, very different. And I kind of need to have many conversations to make sure that the tone, the choice of words was kind of respecting what I wanted to say, what I was, standing for at that moment. And I think that the question of art, it's interesting to see that you have the artistic freedom, but you also have kind of the social acceptability, at one very specific moment. And we kind of we try to understand, what is the context, in which we land when we say something. And obviously it's very difficult to do that. And it means that we need to have conversations about that. Because if you come with a play or a book or anything, or even something from visual arts, and you just give it to the hand of a curator in another country, it's true that they will take your work and they will use your work in the conversation happening at that moment. And sometimes it could be very interesting, very constructive, and sometimes it could be a total disaster. So I think that we kind of need to kind of negotiate daily, our, the artistic freedom, and the what we want to say, and it's and this is why. So we should never take for given that when we say artistic freedom, everybody understands and everybody has the same.
And just to conclude this story, because it was funny how it ended up, because like we had these negotiations in the theater that, okay, it's not fair, it's not possible that you're doing that behind doors, like just can confront me that you want to have more strength to the character. Of course I would say no, but then we will fight. But at least that would be like a free fighting. And then, we had all these debates, and like we came to terms, and like the opening is like in tomorrow and everything. And then in the conference after after the play was premiered, the whole discussion was not about women's rights, not about human rights, not about Syrians' war. It was about the rights of the animals on stage. So, so we just like failed all.
No, but
so we were failed.
I mean, those kind of a moment where you have a debate, an important debate, and then it becomes something.
And like they have also a fair cause, but then like coming up with this question: did you have the consent of the goats before they were on stage? And it was like.
Yeah.
Okay.
And there are moments where that question of rights and are very tense. I remember probably, I've been working in the arts sector, in theater, and now in for 40 years. And probably the most difficult moment in all my career was a couple of years ago when Canada was celebrating its 150th anniversary. And at Canada Council, we kind of took a stance. I said to my team, okay, we will not celebrate the anniversary of this country because there's a lot of people in my country who have no appetite for celebration. So we will, support projects that are marking that moment in history, no matter what their point of view is. And we received a project by one very, very famous artist, I won't mention him. The project was to tell the history of Canada, the history of Canada, including, the colonization, indigenous, and all of that, only with white actors, working with a French company, and there was not even one indigenous people, you know, and as a consultant, and there was a jury, and in that jury there were indigenous jurors, because that's a decision we made, is to make sure that it's diversified, and the conversation about cultural appropriation started. And it was, I mean, what the indigenous artists wanted to say is that we need to own our own stories, and we need to be on the stage to tell those stories. But then it became an incredible debate, because, you know, you had actors, very famous actors, saying, you know, I can, you know, be an indigenous, I can be a man, a woman, I can be homosexual. And it was like if all of a sudden we would have decided that, you know, no one can perform anything but what they are. And it was not the debate. The debate was really about making a space at that moment to make sure that everybody has its own right to tell the story. And it has been, you know, it bubbled for, you know, months and months. And now we are beyond that. Now I think, you know, that we do understand what it is. But again, you know, it's interesting that how fast, you know, a claim for justice can become something, a traumatic experience for the people who are claiming their right, and some kind of you know, a huge debates for all the people who are, in fact, they don't deny the rights of the one who are claiming it, but by just debating something else, they are ignoring what is at stake. And that, I find it revolting. So, anyway, go back to our questions, yeah.
How can leaders leverage their roles as intermediaries between government and the sector, and embed in their work social justice, equity, and respect for the rights and the responsibilities to advance artistic freedom?
Wow, it's a complex one.
Yeah, it took me some time to read it. Oh, wait.
Okay.
There's a longer one. There is a shorter one. I found a shorter one. Is it meaningful to speak of margins and mainstream? Can we co-create new shared narratives?
Oh, that's interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, that question of margin and mainstream is I think in my country for sure, it's a very important discussion for a very simple reason, is that the margins have remained the margins for too long. And now it's time to make sure, you know, that they move, you know, against center stage. So, and that will create new margins for sure. But what I think is really important is that certainly in Canada, there have been margins that have been intentionally built. We call them systemic margins. So it's not an accident that people, you know, with disability or some racialized groups or indigenous, you know, were at the margin. Is because someone, somewhere, or a group of people, the dominant culture, decided that they would remain at the margin. So for me, bringing them inside, but on their own terms, not on the terms of the programmers and all of that, because one of the big things that happened is that when we changed the programs at Canada Council and the criteria for funding, the biggest organizations, because they have the capacity, moved very quickly to say, okay, we'll program an indigenous performance and that and that and that. And it was on their own term. So not seeing that it's not about programming something that comes from what was the margin and what we expect will not stay as the margin, but it's to accept that, you know, they need to do that on their own terms, and it will transform and decolonize and disorganize, and in fact, unplease some of your audience. It will be transformative.
It's a structural difference.
Yeah,
there
that's
should be
systemic.
A
yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So, what do you think about that?
I would take it to the artistic level. Here again, it's, and this is something I also worry about. There was a time that we, opposition artists, let's say, or artists working against the mainstream, we're trying hard to find like independent space to work in. Like we don't want to depend on the money coming from the government. All these, I mean, well-known scenarios, what happens later on if we do depend on that kind of fund. And we kind of got some way out of that after 2011 with all these, I mean, interest in the arts coming to, I mean, like in Syrian art, and like it was a sexy moment, and it was like a market deformative moment for the Syrian art as well. And at that thing, there was a time when like the Syrian films and like theater started to roam in big spaces in the world, and there was one film that came from the regime area, and that was invited to festival in the region, film festival. And yeah, it could be the film that is propagating the regime, done under the regime umbrella, that's all, of course. But then all the filmmakers outside Syria, opposition, signed a petition to prevent and to ban this film from being in that festival. And this happened. The festival approved, and the film was banned. And now I re-question again the rights and responsibilities, because now we're becoming the mainstream, and they are becoming
the new margins.
And then for me, I wouldn't deny it. I was happy and sad. I was happy and ashamed, because we kind of, the revolution started to kind of, the freedom that we worked for started to kind of eat itself up. We turned into a kind of a dictatorship again to ban other films. Of course, here comes the issue of the democracy, when somebody is freely expressing something that is completely against your freedom of speech.
Yeah.
And here comes the whole rhetoric of the right wing. So for me, this kind of loop that all of a sudden you find yourself in is something that is always very good to be aware to. I mean, like, to understand that you could easily turn into, I mean, you're in the margin and you could easily turn into being in the center. And again, the perspective is so important, and who's right? Again.
I will give a very, from the perspective of a funder, an example of how we are trying to cope with, to find some kind of a way in order to prevent a rapid kind of instrumentalization of artists or groups or communities that are or were or have been historically at the margin. And the way we did that is that, 6-7 years ago, a new government came into power in Canada, and their victory was unexpected. But in all the election campaign, they did make the commitment that if elected, they would double the budget of the Canada Council. They have been elected, they delivered that. And the morning, people read in the paper that, yes, the budget would be doubled, all my existing clients made the assumption that they would get, a double check tomorrow morning. And we did not do that. So what we did is we made a very, it looks very kind of simplistic, but the first thing we did is that, okay, we will cap, at, I don't know, it was 40%, I guess, the possibility for existing clients to get, the maximum raise would be 40%. And then we will take the money that was set aside for projects, and we said, okay, that will raise by 250%. Why did we do that? Because we did not want to give all the new money to the organizations who had the agency to kind of invite or not invite artists at the margin, but we would give them directly the money to create their own space. And so the idea was to reinforce an independent scene. And not to kind of say, okay, we will shut down, the institutional scene, but really understanding that it may take a generation for everybody in the independent scene to do things the way they want to do it on their own terms, and forcing eventually, because they will have a lot of money, the institutions to invite them on their own terms. And I was not popular when I went to a gathering with all the leaders of the big organizations, but I realized today that, and we also at that moment said, 25% of all the new money, it was the doubling of the budget, so it was like creating another arts funding from scratch. 25% every year will go to first-time applicants, just to make sure that those new voices could enter and that it would have the space to kind of develop that. And I think this is the only thing, we could do as funders, is to use this kind of a power of enabling, giving the space, not trying to prescribe, not trying to control, not trying to impose anything, but sometimes to hear a voice, you have to say to others, please don't be so loud. We want to hear them. So it's not you cannot speak, but please, just listen a little bit.
Yeah, you also...
I see but we have 10 or 5 minutes? 8, okay.
How did you come up? Okay, so I will postpone my talking about the cultural interventions in refugee camps, because it also pours into that thing about, the funds and how the funds were turning, and how it could have been really, I don't know, how it could have been really more sustainable for the long term in terms of like creating infrastructure and bodies that would really go on and on and on even after the funds disappear.
Yeah.
So I would really take this example from, giving the money directly to the margin to create their own,
Trying to not eliminate, but I think especially for the communities who have no voice or who had no voice in the system, we kind of need to make sure that, it's not because I don't lie. I love a lot of, there are excellent curators, excellent artistic directors, but the problem is that they have a lot of power to make the choices, and we need to make sure that we put enough money and support to make sure that people can, again, do it on their own. And there will be new artistic directors and new curators. How is it that in my country, for years and years, the curators of indigenous arts were white people?
Of course.
So it's kind of the road for ignorance. So I think that is changing, and all those notions of artistic excellence. It's not that artistic excellence will disappear, but it will be redefined, and there will be more perspectives on it, which I think will be richer.
So, would you like to have a question?
Yes, I will take one question. So that's good. I think we kind of, it's interesting. We kind of covered everything except this one. And this one is, how has digitalization, and you're in cinema, so changed the game? Have established structures of creation and distribution been outstripped by democratizing technologies that circumvent institutional power?
Can I have it again?
It's a long one, but it's about technology.
Yeah, I know it's about technology, because I was like fascinated yesterday with reading the American Writers Guild, because they are now on strike, and like 11,500 writers in Hollywood, they stopped writing, and all the night shows and all the comedies that people used to sleep and couch watching them, everything stopped. And I read this declaration, what they have written, and there was a very important sentence, paragraph that I really liked. It's like, writers will never correct scripts coming from AI. One. Writers will never accept that there should be doctor scripting scripts coming from AI. Writers, and there was a whole bunch of things about fear. So there is a huge fear that we're all kind of, especially with this father genius of the AI resigning 2 days ago.
Yeah.
So there is a huge fear of this. I don't know, I still believe in Chomsky's last article when he said, don't be afraid. I really believe that there would all, and the belief comes from my faith in the new generation, not in ours actually. I do believe that working with a new generation in terms of ethics and education, because we're in a moment of like what happened in the industrial revolution, we don't own these tools. We're just like my grandmother when first was seeing the TV, and like she was passing in front of the TV and she was in her towel and she said, yeah, there's a man in the room, and like she started to cover. So I feel that's how we react to this new revolutionary AI tool. Of course there are dangers, but I still believe that maybe in Daphne's, like yesterday in the panel, in Daphne's generation, that they would use these tools in a very ethical way. We are maybe too corrupted to to depend on ourselves in terms of AI. We're greedy, like we're still coming with the tools from the last century. But yeah, I'm not afraid still of AI. I'm like really very curious. But of course, it facilitates a lot. And it creates a lot of fuss, a lot of problem and fuss, but that's exactly how when the electricity came, and that's exactly how when the TV started to be in each house. So there is a moment of, yeah, what do? We're like really coming from a different generation, seeing all this thing in front of us. Yeah, it's like a monster. But I do feel like it's really giving new horizons. Like I've met people in my life that I've never had the chance to meet and like to have conversation with and like to use technology. Cinema is becoming cheaper to be done. I mean, like I could now with my iPhone do lots of things. And Tarkovsky used to stress the idea of like, yeah, cinema is a collaborative art and blah, blah. Yes, but that era started to kind of wither, and like we have to accept it. Of course, technology will shape our lives, but the faith is in the new generation. Like, yeah, that's how I believe.
I so agree with you. I had the chance, because now I'm a grandfather, so I have a lot of grandchildren, and I see them, with technology, and for them, the way they use it is very smart. They're very, very fast, and even, I have a grandson who was born, at 23 weeks, so he has a lot of challenge to. Now he's okay. He's 9 years old. But even before he was able to read, because, he learned, differently than others, the way he used his tablet and everything he learned about the world is, I'm always amazed. I mean, he speaks many different languages, just because he used it. But one thing I need to say for that question is I think during the pandemic in my country, the technology was, because everybody was on, we could not be in live. So everybody was on screen. And one fantastic moment was that a lot of artists we never heard of before, disabled artists and all of that, all of a sudden had exactly an equal space on all the stages because they could do. And I think for institutions, what we need to do is to make sure that people will escape from the digital space. Revolutions needs to migrate from, because we see some revolutions or movements in the world, and for a lot of people it's kind of a show on screen, but it needs to, change the world. And those artists who are, that we discovered for a moment, they need to be seen on the, on the stage when. So the question of, how do we find ways to create corridors for people to go back and forth, from the digital space to the real life and all that. For me, it's a big question.
I mean, the moment was coming, and I think that the pandemic just accelerated this moment.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a more democratization of tools, of, distribution of culture. And of course, coming from Germany, I'm talking about a very slow down and like really old-fashioned theater tradition. All theaters had to now be like have an online platform
to be
for that.
kind of a hybrid.
So I mean,
and all
it's
that.
really accelerated, democratized. Like
Agree.
had this of course it comes with responsibility. We hear about all these stories of abuse that is happening, but I'm telling you, it's the chaos that is accompanying a moment of history when tools are changing.
Yeah, and I agree, and one of my fear now is that in many countries, everything that has been learned and tested, and it's true, it was a moment of cultural democratization, that pandemic. Too many people just want to move to something else and forget about that. But I think that, I said that at the beginning of this week, I think that having conversations with, all of us about the pandemic, not a medical conversation, but the question of, what were the moments of reinvention and why, we keep or why do we ignore them right now is really important. Because, when the big economic crisis happened in the US and all over the world at the beginning of the 20th century, this is where they invented, the welfare states and all those ideas came from a huge economic crisis. And I think that at this moment, it's not obvious that what we invented during the pandemic will be so much transformative. And I think we kind of need to really remind people about those experiences because they have been very, very good. So it's red. We need to wrap up.
Yeah, I just would like to end up with an example that I feel like it's really appalling. I came across this piece of information that certain literature and certain novels are revisited in history to be rewritten according to political correctness and reprinted according to political correctness. And I'm talking here about like the first example that I was able to dig down is the Charlie and the Chocolate Factory and the whole writings of this novelist, Dawes. And yeah, I just leave it for you. I mean, I just leave this question. I mean, is this, freedom of, is this artistic freedom or responsibility? I mean, yeah, of course, political correctness is on the table of everyone, but is it possible that we go and rewrite Dostoevsky, for political correctness? It's appalling for me, and it is sad that we're here over 425 something here people that we cannot do something for that. It's really, it would be sad that we was really, yeah.
Great, I like that. Thank you.
Thank you.
And I just want to say, I was very nervous this morning. It's very difficult to have an intimate conversation in front of 400 people, I must say. But I think we succeeded to have a conversation, and I will,
so
I'm
honored.
really
I'm
honored
happy.
by that.
Yeah, I'm
Thank
so
you.
happy as well. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Liwaa and Simon, for your moving dialogue about how you have both worked to bridge the gap between rights and responsibilities and artistic freedom. Liwaa, it resonated with me that perhaps rather than bridging this gap, that for you, rights and responsibilities are always intertwined, always impacting on each other, and always weighing on the shoulders of artists who bring truth to the world. Your words, "Am I really free?" is a constant awareness of having the advantage of what we may define as artistic freedom, while knowing that your family and people in Syria are still in danger. Living without that freedom that we all benefit from. It takes courage, and there's huge responsibility in knowing that you are always needing to keep your people safe. As artists who work for freedom as you do, is the truth as important as being safe? And Simon then also acknowledging that the right to create and the right to express yourself should be a right that we all have. And most especially the people such as Liwaa's people and the indigenous peoples of your country, Canada, who are being deliberately excluded from this right because systematic cultural genocide of the indigenous people deny them of this right every day. As you said, for many people in this context, it isn't just about the right to express, but it's the right to be who you are. Speak your own language, practice your own culture, and being denied the basic rights of just being. I really loved your words, we need to tell our own stories, and providing the stage to enable Indigenous peoples to take that stage and tell their own stories. You both also spoke about community and cultural freedom, and that arts is about community building and not just about expressing yourself. The important point you both made was that artistic freedom is something that everyone has the right to have. And for those of us as leaders who are in a privileged position of power, it is our responsibility to do whatever we can to ensure this is a right that everyone has. It is an honor to be in the presence of two people who are making the changes that need to be made, often taking risk of your own safety, your own well-beings and livelihoods, always living in the awareness of your responsibility to humanity. Acknowledging rights are not just about your own rights, but the rights of those that you take the responsibility for. Making change is a responsibility for all of us, and the world needs more leaders like you both. Thank you deeply from all of our peoples who live in the margins. Thank you. Okay.